Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on Sunday, August 22nd, 2021. And we were discussing China with Puran. So he referred to a new book for a book that he is revisiting, which seems to have very interesting take on China and what is happening. Puran, do you want to continue the conversation?
Absolutely, Pari. Just to sort of go over the book very briefly, I bought this book in 2013 when it was out, and it is one of the bestsellers brought out by Abacus, about 400 pages. And this is a very absorbing book, Pari, on two levels. One, that this book is all about China's growth story, because this whole book is titled as Wealth and Power. And Chinese very long time back decided to accumulate, economic progress, get more wealth under the garb of communism and continue to grow and develop and so on and so on forth. And these two authors, John and Orwell, they try to sort of take the reader through 11 iconic Chinese figures. And then, they sort of represent a certain time and space. And then there's a lot of continuity. So 11 very iconic, they are military people, they are Chinese thinkers, they are senior
people. When you say 11 thinkers, from what date they start? Are they from Mao Zedong onward, or do they go prior to Mao?
Absolutely. They sort of go down they in a way begin with the overall Chinese philosophy. So they talk about Chinese thinkers. And then they come to how China sort of passed through different stages. And then how did they really told themselves that you will not really be powerful unless you have the wealth. So successively, these two authors try to sort of look through different phases of Chinese economic development. And then they also try to correlate to the economic development to their growth and power dynamic. And then they say that if everything were to stay course, then China is really going to rule the world, at least by end of this century, which is 21st century. So it says power and wealth and power, China's long march to 21st century.
Thank you very much. So on that note, we can now turn it over to Jennifer. Jennifer, you were working on China.
Yes, I was. So I've started going into it, and my research this week focused mainly on how things currently are in terms of SOEs and where they might be going, as well as started to look at China's recent crackdown on big tech, but didn't get that deep into that. And I think I should look at that next week, seeing as how, that's pretty major and has major ramifications for not just Chinese companies, but international situations. What I did find was that there used to be more hope for Chinese reforms of state-owned enterprise, but that has waned in recent years, especially because Jinping has wanted to strengthen SOEs, thinking that will lead to a strengthening of the Chinese Communist Party. So right now, SOEs gained a lot of power during COVID, mostly because they took over when private companies had to go into lockdown. And the government created mixed ownership reforms to try to appease international criticism, but they did very little to change anything practically in terms of how SOEs really function and run most of the economy. They are at the top of most major industry. They get a lot of advantageous policy passed. They are deeply involved in, furthering the Chinese government's policy initiatives, and they're really used as tools for the government under the realm of business. So 91 of the world's top 500 companies are Chinese state-owned enterprises. And if you use the comparative neutrality framework applied to Chinese SOEs, to see, when you compare public and private companies face the same set of rules, Chinese competitive environment is very poor. So even though they are deeply involved in the world economy and deal a lot with capitalism nations, they really are not playing on the same playing field as that. And it makes China a very difficult environment for international private companies and for private companies inside of China trying to compete with SOEs. And then moving on to tech giants, there's been a recent crackdown, whereas it used to be a very hands-off environment. Companies could kind of grow as they wanted. People were able to get very wealthy very quick because of that. Now there's a crackdown. They're using fines, regulatory orders, forced restructurings to really minimize the growth of these major companies like Alibaba and Tencent and Didi Global, mostly because such wealth and power in industries is seen as a direct threat to the Chinese Communist Party consolidation of power. So there's a ton of things that Jinping is going after. And next up, he's probably going to go after platform companies with market power and data rights, as well as try to pass legislation so that they can get access to big data on customers of these major companies.
And what would be the impact of this on China's global competition? Have you looked at that?
Oh, I think that the major impact would be on that, Chinese SOEs become the only real people that you can deal with when dealing with Chinese industry. And there could be, international backlash on dealing with them, especially, with the ethnic cleansing going on in China and the way that a lot of nations aren't so pro-China right now in a lot of ways. That if the state is so deeply involved in companies at the top of every single sector, that could kind of lead to some sort of isolationism or push China towards, a strengthening of their separate sphere of influence that we've spoken a lot about in the international world.
Jennifer, did you look to see what would be the impact in terms of the increasing income gap within the China? That creates a lot of sense of some kind of concern for Chinese government. Could also we view this crackdown on some of tech giants as a way of communicating to general public communicating to general public as a way of that we're concerned about income gap and we are taking action? Could it be just some kind of diplomacy for internal use?
Well, as of right now, listed SOEs account for 40% of market capitalization of Chinese companies. And since 2015, they've raised more than $90 billion in new equity from investors. So they're resting at the top of all of these sectors. And there is an income gap between them and private companies, especially post-COVID, when the government forced a lot of private companies to go into lockdown and SOEs were given a lot of leeway and rights that no other company has, be it domestic in China or international. So I believe that the crackdown and, pushing for SOEs and lack of reform that once was believed would come will lead to a huge gap and allow these companies to rise to the top, especially because a lot of the top Chinese companies are tech giants. And if the SOE lack of reform is going to coincide with a crackdown on private tech giants, then I can only see how Chinese government run companies will be, rise to the top and create a larger gap. But that's what I looked at. Yeah.
Good. And also, I assume you noticed that they're forcing these companies to have a government representative on their board. So yeah. That area also needs some investigation. So have you written your report? Do we have your report in the folder?
It wasn't it's up. It's in the China folder.
Okay.
It's more just a summary of the research I was doing. It's it wasn't structured as in my normal reports, but I can restructure it. Because I was trying to do base level research this week. But yeah, it is in the folder.
Okay, because I didn't look at it, so I will look at it, and yeah, anything, please continue to leave it there so we all could share it. So with that, we have now Paul. Hello, Paul. Paul.
Hi.
Hello.
Sorry, I'm late.
So Paul already spoke about a book that he is revisiting on China, and Jennifer talked about her research on China. I noticed you made some comments on the document I shared. So would you like to share those comments? And actually they were very good. I went through both sources, and thank you very much. Both quite interesting inputs. So do you want to share those with everybody?
Oh, yeah, I can. I mean, I'll just make it very brief, though. Yeah, so I thought a couple of areas to maybe consider a focus on were education. I don't think that gets too much attention, but I think that's sort of important because ultimately China's ability to be successful in anything, like in any organization, depends on the people and their skill and knowledge and so on. I think China has made a lot of progress in improving the education system on one hand, and also they've got a lot of people who are now working in the Chinese government who've spent significant time outside of China, either studying or working. So I think that gives them quite a bit of a valuable perspective, and that they have a lot more insight than we might give them credit for about how to strategize and think about their position on a global stage. I'm sorry, Beck.
Yeah, you also shared Shabu, I think, and that was very interesting as well.
I'm sorry, say again, I didn't miss.
You also shared a comment or a video from Professor Shabu, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there are a couple of references I provided at the end. I don't know, there are a few more that I had in mind, but yeah, I mean, yeah, well, I mean, I think the one that you're talking about, so I had this idea also that, there's a lot of talk about soft power, and China's soft power, and it tends to be addressed in sort of a general way. But I thought if we looked at public relations specifically, and messaging, and I think there too, there's been a lot of refinement and a lot more strategic thinking that goes on, at the highest levels in China, about the narrative that the country tells about itself and the image it tries to portray. And they've really mastered, it seems to me, social media and figuring out how to get their message across in a compelling way. And that 5-10 years ago, they really weren't very sophisticated or refined at all. But I think they've made some really big progress and great strides over the last 5 years, give or take. And I think that that's also valuable and important to consider when you're thinking about China's place, once again, in a global context, and how effective they are in working with other countries and making their presence felt, their position noted on a world stage. So that was sort of another area that I thought was worth looking into a bit.
Yeah, both were very interesting. Both references was quite interesting takes. Any comments from anybody before we move away from China?
Can I come in pretty briefly, Pari? I've been talking to some diplomats as well, because, China has been one place which I've always thought will be very interesting to follow. And, there are 3-4 things. I went through the notes which you have put up on the website, on the Google there, like soft power. Those Chinese have developed quite a lot, but that element of sophistication through the communication and messaging is not really, getting very well cleared out to countries at large. They do a great job, but everything is thought to be driven by, quote unquote, Communist Party of China. And when it comes from Communist Party of China, there's a fairly lower degree or level of credibility that goes along with it. So this is the one part. The second part is that the Chinese, with regard to building the narrative, have been using the Confucius centers in addition to what they do otherwise. And I recall that these Confucius centers are running all over the world, but currently they are under a lot of, stress, where countries are trying to either, put surveillance on them, are trying to monitor who they are, and quite a few countries are really asking Confucius centers to back up and go as well. So, why this soft power and how they communicate and narrate, those things are sort of getting quite mixed up. So countries in Africa might be buying Chinese pretty well, but other parts of the world, maybe Asia, Southeast Asia, and elsewhere, that kind of a credibility is not. This is what I'm being told by some senior diplomats. One of the diplomats I was talking to with regard to Afghanistan, which is going on, and he said the Chinese are very keen on Afghanistan because not that they're very keen to sort of manage and do geopolitics or whatever. They are very keen on copper mines, which are located south of Kabul. And they have been approaching the regime in Afghanistan for the last 12 years. And the diplomat told that, he has seen Chinese pass by American soldiers who were deployed south of Kabul to negotiate the copper mine, business. And then he told me that if you really look at what Chinese have invested in Afghanistan is about 4.5 million USD, while Pakistanis have invested about $110 million. So I asked the diplomat, don't you think that Chinese are trying to invest in copper mine or in Afghanistan through Pakistan? So, China is, it's a very long game, and it gets pretty obvious to people if you really try and observe them from very close quarters. So their soft power is quite mixed up. They have not been really able to influence multilateral institutions. Of course, they have bribed people and tried to do it, but those things are not really going to go far off as people become more enlightened about the ways of doing things and trying to make things happen, that they really like to really see things coming their way through. And as I said last time, Pari, they're educated, people which are basically born after 2020, after 2000, are the sort of bet who will really either take Chinese forward or they could be manipulated in certain ways. So this is brief that I would like to really share that I got to hear from some very senior diplomats who have been, both here and in China and elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I think one problem China is while they have a lot of impressive advancement, but their claim to leadership is questionable, global leadership, because they view other countries or form partnerships or contracts on a transactional basis, where if you're a leader, you got to move out of your interest and as a leader look at long-term interests, but their approach usually is very transactional to me. Greg cannot join us today. He had some family issue, but he wrote an article this week. It was published about Afghanistan. There is a tweet about it in our website. I suggest you guys look at it. It's very interesting and well received. So on that note, I think I'd like to go to Anna. Anna, would you like to tell us in what stage is your project? Let's start with Wikipedia. Have you done anything about Wikipedia?
Hi, Pari. Yeah, so the last 2 weeks, me and my family kind of left London for a little bit. We put everything on hold. I still haven't received any notification on the Wikipedia. I don't quite know what to do apart from that. Like, I've been waiting, but I still haven't received anything. And I think it has been 3 weeks. I can see what else I can do, either if I can contact Wikipedia directly, if there's some sort of like complaints department or something. But from that point, I haven't received anything from the person who tried to delete the page.
Mhm.
And on the project itself as well, I haven't, like these last 2 weeks, I've done nothing. I've been away from London completely. I was hoping maybe we could schedule a meeting as well, because I do know I had some questions whilst reading your email and gathering information. So I think it'll be really useful, because if we can have a meeting, we can just discuss everything in one go.
Well, if you've done anything, I don't see much point on having a meeting because I'm very busy. But I sent you an email some time ago and point out all the information. So I suggest first you do some research, gather some information, look at the sources I have given you, then let's have a meeting.
Okay, that's fine.
All right. Okay, so anything, Paul, you would like to discuss?
Nothing particular. Well, maybe I just mention one thing about the comments in China, if I can. Sorry to dig that up again, but I would say if we consider the soft power of China and the way China presents itself on a global stage, I think you have to look no further than the World Economic Forum and look at Xi Jinping's speeches. He's been invited for the last 3 or 4 years consistently to be a keynote speaker, and has gotten a lot of attention and a lot of people buying into what he's saying. And put on it, I didn't see one mention of the Communist Party in any of his speeches. So I'm not quite sure where the idea is that China is leading with the Communist Party message. In fact, I think they've learned that that's not going to work too well. Confucius Institutes, that was from 2004, right? And the Chinese government itself has reduced the funding in Confucius Institutes because there's been quite a bit of backlash. I would regard that as an experiment, and a fairly inexpensive one. So I think that there's been a lot of change over the last few years that needs to be taken into account.
So maybe we need to dig in, and if you have resources and things, we share resources on soft power and better understand what's going on. The document I have shared with all of you is a living document. So I want everybody, any ideas, just to add it. So eventually we will have this very comprehensive sort of points of view to go through.
Can I quickly comment on what Paul said? You know, I have data. It says, Paul, that China's investment in Confucius Center, both directly and indirectly, because they later on, halfway through, they became very indirect. And if you really look into Europe, what has really been happening, where Hungarians are trying to build a university, which is Fudan, which has really caught up in attention, where Chinese really took a little U-turn and said that while we will continue to promote and make Confucius centers flourish, we will also try to take indirect route where we will bring in Fudan, for example. And I can tell you something, Paul. In Europe, Pari, these guys will come, do their meetings, and nobody will really know what meeting was. And then other embassies will scramble to figure out what was the meeting all about. So these Confucius centers came under surveillance simply because Chinese intelligence and diplomats, they will go and do the meetings and go on. So while they were on course till about 2015 or 16, but then they took the U-turn, and then they tried to sort of invest the money through a number of other initiatives. I tell you about India, for example. In India, Chinese were funding about 16 think tanks. And these think tanks could not be funded directly through Communist Party. And therefore, they began to sort of expand on Confucius centers, who became the conduit for doing what they did with several think tanks in India. Now everything is under surveillance. So all that Chinese have been trying to do is being direct, but if you get caught, you take a little detour and try and do the same thing, but in a slightly different way. So countries are beginning to understand what they're doing and how could you really get into a trap which is military, come economy, come equity into businesses, and so on and so on forth. So this is my brief note on Confucius Center. The second one on soft power, I mean, there is a study which is all about, place of Great Britain in 21st century. That research was undertaken by one of my friends who headed Amnesty International in London. And if you really look at soft power of, Europeans or Britain or the US versus soft power that we have been talking about, there is a bit of disconnect to me. I mean, this is where I will really stop, Pari. And that's my brief footnote to what Paul said.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Puran. I think what we need to do is to do a bit deeper research on soft power and understand, because they go through stages. One thing about, I think, China is they reflect and they adapt, which is a very good part of them. They don't always, in my opinion, listen well, but nevertheless, they reflect and adapt and, evolve. So it will be good to look to see how they have changed. And certainly world economic power is quite, sort of powerful, but maybe they have shifted from one kind of style to another one, and it's good to better understand how they're communicating. And also they recently have adopted very different diplomacy, which is also interesting to look into. So they're changing constantly and needs to be investigated. So on that point, is there any comment anybody wants to make? No. So Jennifer, which area are you going to focus on?
I was going to focus on big tech and the crackdown, but I can go another direction if you think that would be more helpful.
I think the direction you're taking is pretty good, because that's what we want to understand.
Okay.
All right. So any comments from anybody? No? Okay. On that note, then I wish everybody a wonderful week ahead. Thank you for the work you have done. And I look forward to see you next week. Take care. Bye.
Take care.